Joining me now is Sarah Matthews, former Trump White House Deputy Secretary. Thank you for being with us. It's now been a year since you testified before the January 6th committee. In the time since, what can you tell us about your contact with Special Counsel Jack Smith's team?
I don't want to go into too much detail about, my communications with the special counsel, but what I will say is that I cooperated voluntarily, just as I did with the congressional committee that investigated January 6th. And I think that that's a key distinction between the special counsel and the congressional committee is that the special counsel's office will have had access to a lot more witnesses than what the House committee had access to, just because of the subpoena power. And so I think that when this potential indictment does drop, that they'll have even more evidence than what we saw from the House committee.
You know, Sarah, I know you don't want to get into too much detail, but you're sort of in one of those unique positions where we can ask you whether the questioning with the special counsel's team lines up with that of the House Select Committee. What can you tell us about that? How much the Select Committee sort of laid out a roadmap for the special counsel?
Yeah, I think that the House committee laid out a fantastic roadmap for the special counsel to follow, in the sense that the special counsel office was able to see what my testimony already was in front of the January 6th committee. And so I think that there were a lot of things that they didn't have to ask me about because they already knew what my responses were going to be based on the public testimony that I gave before the committee.
And Sarah, I appreciate that you have a tremendous respect for the judicial system and wanting everything to go through the appropriate process. But can you tell us, have you testified before the grand jury?
I have not.
Is that something that you anticipate being asked to do at a later time, or something you'd be willing to do?
Like I said, I voluntarily cooperated with the special counsel. So if there came a time where they asked me to, that would be something I'd be more than willing to do, but I don't see it on the horizon.
Sarah, a federal grand jury heard testimony this week from former White House aide William Russell. He now works for Trump's presidential campaign. And NBC News has learned the prosecutors questioned him about Trump's state of mind during and after that whole election period. I mean, how closely did you work with William Russell, and how significant do you think his perspective could be?
I think that his perspective could be really helpful to the special counsel's investigation. He was someone that I definitely crossed paths with. He was one of the trip directors in the advanced department. And so he was on the road with President Trump. Anytime that he was traveling, he would be aboard Air Force One with him, and kind of acted as a body man for him at events and would be backstage with him. So this is someone who definitely had very close proximity to the president, who the president would know by name. And obviously he followed him to Mar-a-Lago and after Trump left the White House. And so their relationship is still close, given that he is on the campaign. Yeah. I am curious. I don't know if this has been reported, if Will Russell's lawyer is being funded by the Trump organization. So I think that that's something that will be key with, determining his credibility with his testimony. But if he has good lawyers, and I would assume that they assured him to be honest and truthful and transparent in his testimony before the grand jury.
But Sarah, given that you saw him work closely with the former president, do you think that William Russell would have specific information about his boss's frame of mind around that time? I guess particularly if publicly he was citing fraud and decreeing fraud, but privately was conceding that he lost the election.
I think it's certainly something that he could have been privy to. Like I said, this would have been someone that Donald Trump knew and traveled with often. And so I think he would have had access to those kinds of conversations where things of that nature would have been discussed.
Sarah, I want to play something former January 6th committee lead investigator Tim Heaphy said yesterday on this program about the particular Rolling Stone article you see on your screen. Let's listen.
It could be a link between the president and others in the White House and the rioters. That's the significance of the Willard and the War Room. And I can't say that we found such a connection. The War Room is where, as you said, Steve Bannon and Rudy Giuliani and John Eastman, Bernie Kerik, I think Mike Flynn, there were a number of people there working on their sort of investigation into these bogus theories of election fraud and the strategy for January 6th. Roger Stone was there, and he had security, as did Mike Flynn, from the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys. And there was always an assumption that he and that Bannon, that others were sort of the connection between the White House and those extremist groups. We didn't get that kind of cooperation and could not establish that link. But that is precisely why the special counsel, I think, is interested in the activity at the War Room.
Sarah, do you know of anyone inside the White House on and around January 6th with any connection or communication to this so-called War Room at the Willard Hotel?
That wasn't something that I was involved with or anyone on our team, to my knowledge, but I think that that will be something crucial that the special counsel is looking into, given that it seems that there may or may not have been communication with those kinds of far-right extremist groups.
Do you think that there might not be a connection that you know of because there really wasn't a line of communication between the War Room and to Trump? Or do you think that the players, if they had that communication, did so very carefully?
I think that, I definitely wouldn't have had access or would have been privy to that kind of planning or conversations of anything of that sort, given my role being in the press team. But I think that it's possible that they definitely did communicate with those folks and knew that they needed to do so very carefully and try to keep it hidden.
You know, Sarah, your testimony in front of the January 6th Select Committee was powerful, in which you talk about his multiple opportunities to quell some of the violence we saw that day, but instead a lot of the tweeting was very sympathetic to the people who were breaking into the Capitol and committing that violence. As someone who was with the former president on January 6th, what are your thoughts on potential charges in connection with the events that led to that riot? Do you think that, given what we know from the Select Committee, do you think that the special counsel eventually will be able to unearth enough evidence to charge the former president?
I think so. I don't want to get into specifics of what I think those charges will look like. I'll leave that to the legal experts. And obviously, we need to see what the potential indictment does even look like and what additional evidence that the special counsel uncovered that maybe the House committee did not uncover. And so obviously, I think that the House committee laid out a lot of evidence, though, making the case for some charges. I think it's very clear that Donald Trump was told multiple times from the campaign, from his White House staff, that he lost the election, that there was no evidence of substantial fraud. And he continued to push that lie and tried to overturn, in a very coordinated effort, tried to overturn the results of the election. And so I think that there will most likely be some of those charges that the House committee recommended.
Sarah, I want to play you something that you said about the president's social media post back when you testified before the January 6th committee.
I worked on the campaign, traveled all around the country, going to countless rallies with him, and I've seen the impact that his words have on his supporters. They truly latch on to every word and every tweet that he says, and so I think that in that moment, for him to tweet out the message about Mike Pence, it was him pouring gasoline on the fire and making it much worse.
Sarah, given that we haven't really seen any of the vitriol diminished, and as we see Trump's upcoming trial set to collide with the campaign, do you have concerns over the rhetoric and what rhetoric can lead to?
I'm very concerned. I think that if Donald Trump learned anything from January 6th, 2021, it is that his words are valuable to his supporters. I think he knew that going in, but even more so, we've seen him recently using this kind of rhetoric. He seems to be encouraging violence. He said something recently, I think just this week, about if he were to go to jail, that his supporters are very loyal and that they would be upset. And so that is super concerning to me, because I think he knows that his rhetoric can lead to some of his most loyal supporters acting out violence in his name. And so I'm very worried for what could happen if a potential indictment relating to this case drops.